Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my mini lecture on endocrine regulation patterns. The endocrine system has almost as many different ways of regulating the body as it has hormones, but the different regulations tend to fall in a couple of patterns. There are two possible big picture patterns. The first is what we call a single hormone feedback loop. That's where one thing happens and it feeds back to the start, and you have only one hormone involved. This is used for activities that need to be regulated on a relatively short time scale or with relatively simple activity. The other option is a multi-hormone feed-forward cascade. This is where one hormone triggers another hormone, and the action, if you draw it the right way, looks like water falling down a cascade. Okay, water falling down a cascade. This is used for activities that need master regulation, maybe from the hypothalamus or from multiple organs working together over a longer time scale. There are also two possible types of feedback that can combine with either the single hormone loop or the multi-hormone cascade. You can have negative feedback, which is where something starts the cascade or the loop and something feeds back that is opposite of the initial start. So blood pressure goes up, so something happens and blood pressure goes back down. You can also have positive feedback. This is where something happens to start the activity and something else happens to strengthen or speed up that process, and it just keeps building and building and building the more times you go through the loop. That's usually used to accomplish a task, to add to the change until some goal is accomplished. And we'll talk about some examples of that in a minute. Okay, so these two patterns, the loop and the cascade, can be combined with the other two patterns, negative and positive, to get a negative loop, which is your simple homeostasis, blood sugar, blood calcium, that sort of thing, or a negative cascade, which is something like thyroid hormone, where multiple organs are coming together, or low blood pressure, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Multiple organs are working together in a cascade, but it still has the pattern of a negative feedback. We can also combine with positive feedback to have a positive loop, which is typically used in, the two typical examples we give are childbirth and nursing. The muscular contractions that push the baby out of the womb or that push the milk out of the breast are both powered by positive feedback. Or you can have a positive cascade, where again several organs are working together, or several chemicals within the blood, in the case of hemostasis, several things are working together in a cascade, but there's a positive feedback element that speeds it up or builds it up over time. Okay, to make it happen as fast as possible. Okay, so let's look at the simple feedback. The simple feedback loop has four parts: a controlled condition, a control center, a signal, and an effector. Let's think about a really simple example in your home. If you have a hot day like today, or a cold day in January, and your heater air conditioner is working. So the controlled condition would be the household temperature. When that condition changes, the control center, which is your little thermostat box or Nest controller or whatever you have these days, will sense that condition change, and it will send a signal. In this case, it would usually be electricity, to something called an effector, something that can have an effect on the system. That would be your furnace in the winter, or your air conditioning compressor in the summer. And then the system responds to the effector. Okay, that's where you have negative feedback. Okay, let's use the example of a hot summer day. The condition change was an increase in temperature. The system response then is a decrease in temperature. And if we look, those are negative from each other. They are opposite to each other. So that makes this negative feedback. This work in the endocrine system. The control center in the endocrine system is always an endocrine gland. The signal in the endocrine system is always a hormone. And the effector is what we call a target organ, or sometimes a target tissue. Sometimes it's a specific tissue within the organ, or maybe it's a tissue that's found lots of places in the body, like adipose tissue. Okay, so let's take the example of blood glucose. The controlled condition changes, your blood glucose goes up or down. An endocrine gland, in this case the pancreas, detects that change, and it releases a hormone. Most of us know at this point that if you're hyperglycemic, you need insulin, so that's the hormone that would be released here. That hormone goes to one or more target organs, okay? And those target organs produce a system response. So the liver, for example, takes glucose out of the blood and stores it as glycogen. The adipose tissues take glucose out of the blood and store it as fat. And the ultimate response that the system has is that the blood glucose goes back down. So again, we started with a high blood glucose. We end with a drop in blood glucose. And so we see that those are negative of each other. So this is a negative feedback system. What about positive feedback? We have all the same pieces, but in this case we have a problem to solve instead of a condition to control. Okay, the same steps happen, except that this time the system response adds to the original change. And we keep going through the loop. And we keep going through the loop. Now you can see that this would go on and on forever, getting faster and faster or stronger and stronger. So there's got to be something called a stop condition, something that breaks the loop. Okay. How does this work in the endocrine system? Well, the endocrine gland is almost always going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hormone is almost always going to be oxytocin, and the target organ is going to vary depending on what problem we're trying to solve. So let's look at the childbirth example. Okay, the condition change is that the baby moves into the mother's birth canal. It starts to stretch the cervix and the vagina. Well, stretch sensors inform the hypothalamus, which informs the pituitary, which release the hormone oxytocin. Okay, the target organ in this case would be the uterus, specifically the myometrium of the uterine wall, okay, the muscular layer, and it would stimulate contractions. Well, what's going to happen if you contract the uterus when the baby's head is already pushing into the birth canal? It's going to add to the change. The baby moves further into the birth canal. If we look at this now, we see that these are not opposites. In fact, the baby moving into the birth canal adds to the baby stretching the birth canal. So that's why this is called positive feedback. We're adding to the system. So since we've now got the baby moving further into the birth canal, we have a stronger stretch of the cervix and the vagina. We've got a stronger release of oxytocin, so we get stronger contractions, so the baby moves more into the birth canal. So we get more baby stretching and more oxytocin and more uterine contractions. and this just keeps going until we reach a stop condition, which is what? It's the baby coming out of the mom, right? Once the baby is out of the birth canal, there's no more stretching, and so the pituitary stops releasing oxytocin, and so the uterus can slow down its contractions and wind that process down, and the mom can finally relax. Okay. What about big picture pattern 2, the hormone cascade? This is a little harder to wrap your mind around, so let's get into it. We have still a condition change, but this time it drives a first controller to affect a second controller to affect a third controller to finally send a signal to some sort of effector. And then the system responds to that effector. There may be within this system feedback at different levels. Okay. Where is this used in real life? Well, it's kind of complicated. In your car engine or in one of those chemical plants around Baytown, you might have the air temperature coming into the engine changes how fast affects a first controller that sends a signal to another one that affects how much gas is being added through the fuel injectors, which sends a signal to another controller that affects the throttle position, and eventually we get to the speed of the engine, which is the whole system response, right? And then if the engine speeds up more than it's supposed to, we need to feed that back to that whole series of controllers so that we're not overpowering the engine or underpowering the engine. Okay, so this is used in a lot of complicated engineering situations in the real world, but also used in the body, where the body condition is sensed by a first organ, often but not always the hypothalamus of the brain, which sends a hormone to, often but not always, the anterior pituitary, or ant pit for short. Sounds like a horrible place to have a picnic. Which it sends a signal to the target gland, the endocrine gland that's finally going to release our major hormone. And our major hormone number 3, assuming it's a 3-hormone system, our major hormone number 3 goes to the target organs, and that has an effect on the body. This is how the thyroid hormone works. This is how the long-term stress hormone cortisol works. This is how all of the sex hormones and the growth hormone work that drive growth spurts and reproductive development. So there are a lot of cases where this happens in the body. This is also somewhat how the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system regulates blood pressure, though it's even more complicated than the drawing I have on the board here. Okay. The body response goes backward. In some cases, there might be some positive feedback indicated by the green line there. In other cases, there might be negative feedback indicated by the pink line. You can actually have a mix of the two in the same system sometimes because this is such a multi-hormone system. All right. Now, pause the video at this point, and for each, well, pause after I stop talking to you. Pause the video at the end of this slide, and for each of the 7 examples below, I want you to take out a sheet of paper and first identify, do you think it's positive or negative feedback, and do you think it's a single loop or a multiple cascade control? And then, if you have that level of knowledge, see if you can draw some of the hormone systems involved, okay? When you're done playing around with this slide, move on to the next one and I'll tell you about the little picture pattern. Okay? We've been talking so far about the big picture pattern. Each hormone has essentially the same little picture pattern. There is a stimulus that arrives at a gland, which causes the gland to secrete a hormone, which travels to a target organ or tissue and has an effect on that organ or tissue, and through that organ or tissue, it has an effect on the whole body. What you need to know for each hormone is the stimulus, okay? know what tells the gland to secrete the hormone. And here we're looking for the most proximal cause to the organ. Okay, if there's a hormone that stimulates another hormone, that's what we're looking for. So thyroid stimulating hormone secretes, is the stimulus for thyroid hormone. ACTH is the stimulus for cortisol. Know what gland, know what organ secretes the hormone. That's kind of obvious. Hormone, know all the names and abbreviations. Most of these hormones have one name and one abbreviation. Some of them, though, have various ones. Antidiuretic hormone is also known as vasopressin, for example. Target, know what organs or tissues respond to signals from the hormone. Okay, this may be more complicated than you think. It may not necessarily be the whole bone. It may be specific cells or tissues within the bone. It may not be the entire kidney. It may be a specific part of the kidney that responds. Finally, effect, know what the target organs or tissues do in response to the hormone and what effect that has on the body as a whole. Okay, so we're looking for both the micro and the macro. So micro, liver stores glucose as glycogen. Macro, because the liver is storing glucose as glycogen, blood glucose drops. And finally, I want you to know the pattern of regulation. Is the hormone part of a loop or part of a cascade? Is it part of a positive feedback system or a negative feedback system? And I've given you, or I will give you in class, a series of hormone cards to fill out for each hormone that we're learning so that you can write down the stimulus, the gland, the hormone, the target, the effect, the pattern.